New tools should lead to more precise diagnoses. We should rather liquidate them, say critics. In recent years, there has been a significant increase in the number of Danes receiving a psychiatric diagnosis. In the coming time, a new version of the WHO's diagnosis system must be implemented here at home. This will lead to more accurate diagnosis and make it possible to help more people, experts believe. But for critics, the diagnoses are part of the problem rather than the way to a solution. Sissel Skofjørg is one of over 500,000 Danes who meet the criteria for mental illness. But she does not agree with her borderline diagnosis. I am stuck in the system, with what is probably a misdiagnosis, even though I actually have autism. Modern Times. 19th February 2022. Once upon a time, 38-year-old Sissel Skofjørg lived a life without major worries. She was married to Henrik, with whom she lived on a farm in southern Jutland. She had just started teacher training in Haderslev and rode her horses in her spare time. It was supposed to be the beginning of a good, stable family and working life. Today, she is an early pensioner after a long course of forced admissions, belt fixations and what, according to her and a private psychiatrist, was a misdiagnosis. Sissel Skofjørg was subjected to violent abuse when she was 7 years old. This means that she has trauma that first came to the surface when she was a young adult, which resulted in a psychiatric hospitalization in 2009. Here she was diagnosed with PTSD, depression and eating disorder. A year later, she was also diagnosed with borderline, a personality disorder characterized by impulsivity and strong emotional reactions. Over the course of 10 years, she received various forms of antidepressants and antipsychotic medication for her diagnosis, and at one point she had over 10 diagnoses in her patient record, which information has had the opportunity to see. Today she is on early retirement because she has no real ability to work. It is the borderline diagnosis that has resulted in her being entitled to early retirement. But Sissel Skofjørg does not believe that the symptoms that characterize borderline are consistent with her own experience. For example, she experiences neither a feeling of inner emptiness nor intense and unstable relationships, since she has many close friends and acquaintances she has known for a long time. And she does not believe that a proper investigation was carried out before she was diagnosed. TIOREN fell for Sissel Skofjørg when, during an examination by a private psychiatrist, she was told that she does not suffer from borderline, but rather autism. She herself describes it as a huge aha experience. It made it possible for me to understand why I have needed a lot of structure throughout my life, she says. And since neither she nor the psychiatrist believed that she suffered from borderline, she tried, over the next few years, to have the diagnosis removed from her patient record, but without success. I'm stuck in the system, with what is probably a misdiagnosis, even though I actually have autism. It is problematic, because there are two very different ways of meeting a person, depending on whether the person suffers from borderline or autism, she says. Sissel Skofjørg's borderline diagnosis is still in her medical record, even though she is convinced that she does not suffer from borderline. Sissel Skofjørg is one of over 500,000 Danes who meet the criteria for mental illness, which the organization's Dansk Patienter Bedre Psykiatri describe as the biggest public illness in Denmark. It is estimated that 1 in 3 Danes will be affected by a mental illness during their lifetime, according to a study published in the journal Psychiatry. On the one hand, the need for help to deal with psychological challenges is therefore conspicuous, and in that light one could argue that there is more need for psychiatry than ever. On the other hand, Psychiatry is also plagued by a number of problems. Often it is about a lack of beds and political under-prioritization, but lately the debate has taken on a more fundamental question. Do we have the right approach to diagnostics in psychiatry and psychology today? New diagnostic system on the way. The debate has threads going back to the 1960s, when the Norwegian Chen, in connection with fieldwork at a psychiatric hospital, saw tendencies towards a culture of diagnosis. The sociologist experienced that professionals were strongly concerned with placing patients' utterances and actions in a diagnostic scheme, and that it was difficult for the patient to oppose the treatment they received. The well-known professor of psychology Sven Brinkmann has also treated the subject diligently and described how diagnoses are increasingly used by the layman to understand human deviations and fluctuations. The issue is particularly urgent these years, since the 11th version of the ICD, the WHO's diagnosis classification system, entered into force in January and must be implemented in Denmark in the coming years. It is the system that psychiatrists and psychologists use as a starting point when making a diagnosis. According to a number of professionals, the new tool will mean that more precise diagnoses will be made in the future. Critics, however, believe that the ICD system itself is part of the problem and that a completely different approach to mental disorders is needed, which is far less based on diagnosis. The birth and development of diagnoses. You have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to find the first approaches to the diagnostic system for mental disorders that exist today. The German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin was one of the founders of the discipline and the first to design an actual diagnostic system. Kraepelin discovered that by identifying patterns of symptoms one could classify certain psychiatric diagnoses. It is his classifications that form the basis of the diagnostic systems we know today, the ICD, which is used in Europe, and the American DSM. While early versions of the ICD only included somatic diseases, the first version to classify mental disorders, ICD-6, was published in 1948. Over the years, however, many more diagnoses and categories have been added to the diagnostic system. In ICD-8 there were 180 diagnoses according to a count prepared by Rolle Morse, professor at the Research Unit for Psychosis at Aarhus University Hospital Psychiatry. For comparison, there were 380 diagnoses in ICD-10. Without the diagnoses, we would be on the master's field, believes Mary Nordentoft, professor of psychiatry at the University of Copenhagen and senior physician at the Psychiatric Center Copenhagen. It would be the equivalent of breaking your leg and not getting a diagnosis, she says. But where diagnoses in the somatic area are made, after, for example, blood tests and screenings, one has more difficult prerequisites in psychiatry. Here, differential diagnosis is crucial, which means distinguishing between diseases with overlapping symptoms. There we will have to deal with the clinical picture of the disease. An example is that psychotic symptoms in connection with abuse can be caused by both intoxication and withdrawal. In that case, it is crucial in terms of treatment to know whether it is one or the other, explains Mary Nordentoft. Therefore, she does not believe that a misdiagnosis in psychiatry is much different than in the somatic field. But the increase in the number of people receiving a diagnosis has certainly contributed to the perception that psychiatry is a less exact science than somatic science. The number of adults with a psychiatric diagnosis in Denmark has increased significantly in recent years and actually grew by 30% from the period 2014 to 2018, according to figures from the National Board of Health and Welfare. Is there a picture emerging that we diagnose more rather than that there are necessarily more patients? It's hard to say, because I don't think people were less sick 20 years ago. But more people report that they feel bad and seek help. In the field of children, people have become more aware that there is something called ADHD. It cannot be denied that it has helped many parents to get help for their children. The acceptance that people are different disappears when we diagnose everything, says Cicely Skvjug, who today lives in her own apartment, has 2 horses and gives lectures about her time in psychiatry. But according to her, it is not the psychiatric treatment that has helped her here. A tsunami of diagnoses. There is research which looks at possible reasons for the explosive increase, but there is no agreement on the explanation among psychologists, psychiatrists and other medical professionals. Jonas Sven-Erik is a psychologist and former employee in psychiatry, and he is convinced that the increase is due to overdiagnosis in psychiatry. I think it's a problem that psychiatric diagnoses are made at all today, he says. He is part of a small movement among psychologists who advocate for phasing out diagnosis in the long term. The rationale is, among other things, that the diagnosis can contribute to the stigmatization of patients, an unnecessary illness, and potentially lead to incorrect treatment. In his private practice, he helps clients with what he calls a de-psychiatrization, a form of therapy in which he tries to teach those previously diagnosed that they should not identify with or allow themselves to be limited by their diagnosis. But isn't there someone who would actually benefit from knowing, I have ADHD, that's why I've had these challenges? If people think it's nice to be able to identify with ADHD, then I don't want to take anything away from them. But I want to contribute to people being able to live their best lives, and I don't think the diagnoses are a way to do that. As an alternative, Jonas Sven-Erik refers to experiences from Finland, where the therapy form open dialogue has been gaining ground since the 1980s. It is a different approach to curing psychosis, where you focus on gaining an understanding of the whole person, and especially the patient's relationships. Therefore, many from the Citizens Network are involved, such as family, friends and former colleagues. On that basis, you find out which way the treatment should go, and whether, for example, family therapy is irrelevant to all. Open dialogue has already been tried as a treatment option here at home, and a Danish study, published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies, has shown that patients who have received help with the open dialogue methods have less need for acute psychiatric treatment than other patients. But there is still no research that clearly shows that open dialogue should have a more positive effect than other treatment. Although the method cannot necessarily replace psychiatry, according to Jonas Sven-Erik, it should be spread more widely in Denmark. And he doubts that an updated version of the ICD is what is needed to give more patients the right help. It might make sense to have a system to speak from, but if more diagnoses come with ICD-11, ICD-12 and the next versions, there will be almost no one in Denmark who does not want a diagnosis. We need the opposite of ICD-11, he believes. John Brodersen is a specialist in general medicine, professor at the University of Copenhagen, co-author of a forthcoming book on overdiagnosis in the healthcare system. He also believes that the increase in the number of citizens who are given a psychiatric diagnosis reflects a problem in the diagnosis systems themselves. There has been a dilution or a slide, where milder and milder symptoms are included in the diagnosis, and at the same time there have been more diagnoses, says Brodersen, who frankly speaks of a tsunami of psychiatric diagnoses. In ICD-11, One of the new additions is the diagnosis prolonged grief disorder, where the criteria are that the grief reaction is pervasive, persistent, atypically prolonged compared to what is expected within a given social, cultural and religious norm. We live in a culture where we have to be perfect and flawless, and now grief can be a diagnosis, even though most people go through a period of grief in their lives, says John Broderson. He recognizes that there is a need for a system of categories which makes it possible to classify mental disorders. But instead of expanding the number of diagnoses, one should limit them, so that not all deviations or fluctuations are interpreted as diagnoses. We cannot do without diagnoses. On the other hand, if you ask Professor of Psychiatry Ernst Nielsen, the development of recent years, where more people are given a diagnosis, rather indicates that there has been undertreatment in psychiatry in the past. There has been a greater focus on the fact that psychiatric diagnoses are not something you have to accept and that it can be treated far more often than was previously the case, says Ernst Nielsen, who is also chairman of the Diagnostic Committee under the Danish Psychiatric Association Company and helped to translate and implement ICD-11 in a Danish context. And the new version opens up new ways of thinking about diagnostics, he explains. It must contribute to more thorough investigations of the patient and diagnosis, characterized by greater reliability, i.e. reliability. A high reliability will mean that a patient can, in principle, go to 10 psychiatrists and get the same diagnosis, he explains. At the same time, high reliability means that you can compare test results about treatment and disease course across countries. Part of the criticism of the diagnosis is that the patient risks receiving incorrect treatment with the wrong diagnosis. But Ernst Nielsen points out that one should not equate a certain diagnosis with a certain treatment. You can easily have a diagnosis which makes a number of different treatments likely, where some will, for example, benefit greatly from medication. But the classification must be made as uniform as possible, so that the same criteria data can be used all over the world, he says. Over time, there have been many more so-called diagnosis codes in the ICD. These are codes that describe the diagnosis and, in certain cases, the degree of the diagnosis. According to Ernst Nielsen, they have helped to make diagnostics more accurate. There is a higher specificity in what we describe. Years ago, you would not have described the state the patient was in if they had bipolar disorder. Today we will describe whether it is a mania or mild to moderate depression. The latest versions of the ICD include more symptoms and diagnosis than before, for example prolonged grief disorder. Could this not lead to too many eventually being able to receive a psychiatric diagnosis? I don't think that's correct. A basic criterion for all psychiatric diagnoses is that there must be distress for the person or the environment and a functional impact for the person himself. Fortunately, the vast majority are not permanently tormented. The person before the diagnosis. Psychologist Jonas Venik-Detlevsen, who is highly critical of current diagnostics, believes that Danish professionals should pay more attention to new treatment methods abroad. In England, a number of psychologists from the British Psychological Society have thus designed an alternative to the diagnostic system that is used today. The Power Threat Meaning Framework, PTMF, is the name of the initiative, which defines the main question as what has happened to you, rather than what is wrong with you. In the model, the psychologist interviews the person concerned over several days, and based on the interviews, a so-called case formulation is made, which, without making a diagnosis, describes an appropriate treatment for the citizen's problems. But is it realistic to implement something that is so different from what we operate with today? I am at the point where I think a 10-year plan is less appropriate than a 10-year winding down of psychiatry. I don't want to shut down the psychiatric system tomorrow, but I would like to have the debate about whether we can test a system that is not based on a hospital and is located outside of psychiatry, says Jonas Van-Eyck Ditlevsen. However, Ren Ernst Nielsen does not see the English alternative as a viable path. Firstly, the diagnostic system is the most accurate work tool that psychiatrists have at their disposal, and it enables professionals across the countries to agree on the right help. Secondly, in the diagnostics, you already ask about the patient's current life events, regardless of which diagnosis you are dealing with, he says. Today we ask very broadly and systematically. An example would be a patient experiencing sadness. If we find out that the person in question has recently flunked an exam and has only experienced sadness for a short time, then it is more likely that this is the cause of the sadness rather than a long-term depression. However, Ren Ernst Nielsen has no doubt that the diagnostics will still be able to be improved over time. I hope that in 10 years we can look back and say that we should have changed this a bit earlier, because we have now become wiser. But I don't see that we can do without psychiatric diagnosis, just as we cannot do without making a cancer diagnosis. The right diagnosis. Cecil Iskofjek's borderline diagnosis is still in her medical record, even though she is convinced that she does not suffer from borderline. On the other hand, she has been happy that the private psychiatrist in her time suggested that she suffered from autism, as it has been able to explain many of the problems she encounters in everyday life. The right diagnosis can certainly be a help, but you really have to be sure that you make the right diagnosis, she says. In retrospect, Cecil Iskofjek would have liked a more thorough investigation an alternative to the treatment she received in psychiatry. She herself speaks for a trauma-based treatment, where you focus more on what the patient has experienced in the past and less on what they are experiencing now. The acceptance that people are different disappears when we diagnose everything. When there are more and more diagnoses, I think we are making too many people ill, she says. Cecil Iskofjek with her horse. Today, Cecil Iskofjek lives in her own apartment, has 2 horses and lectures about her time in psychiatry. But according to her, it is not the psychiatric treatment that has helped her here. On the other hand, it is, among other things, body therapy that has enabled her to deal with the trauma, and which has been the only thing that helped. Today I have more hope for the future, she says. Before, I was afraid that I would die from self-harm, but now I haven't harmed myself for over 4 years.